At some point, you've probably asked a simple question: why was this denied? And instead of an answer, you got a sentence: the criteria was not met. This request cannot be approved. The system flagged it. Those sentences sound complete, professional, final. But notice what they don't do. They don't explain the decision. They don't tell you who made it. And they don't give you anything you can challenge. Authority used to require an explanation. Someone had to justify the outcome. Increasingly, it doesn't. This video isn't about AI making bad decisions. It's about what happens when authority no longer needs to explain itself. Not that long ago, authority was personal. If your insurance claim was denied, a person denied it. If a loan was rejected, someone reviewed the application. If a benefit was removed, someone signed off on that decision. And if you asked why, there was a reason attached to it. It might not have been satisfying. It might not have been fair, but it was accountable. Explanation created friction. Friction created accountability. And accountability made decisions reversible. You could question the reasoning. You could challenge the interpretation. You could escalate to someone higher. There was a chain of responsibility, a structure you could move through, a person who had to defend the outcome. Authority required justification, and justification required ownership. That ownership mattered because someone had to stand behind the decision. Someone had to say, "This is correct," or "This needs to change." Authority carried weight because it carried a name. Today, notice what's changed. Not the existence of authority, but its form. Listen to the language. The system flagged it. The criteria weren't met. This request cannot be approved. Those statements feel like explanations. They sound structured. They sound procedural. They sound complete. But they are not explanations. They are conclusions. They describe an outcome without exposing the reasoning that produced it. The sentence replaces the reasoning. You're told you can appeal. That sounds like recourse. That sounds like accountability. But the appeal does not introduce new reasoning. It does not reach someone empowered to reconsider the logic. It does not reopen the judgment. It routes back into the same process. Same criteria, same structure, same evaluation pathway. Nothing about the logic changes, only the digital trail. The question, why, never re-enters the system. The workflow has already executed. The decision has already been produced. And the output is treated as sufficient. The process itself becomes the justification. What used to require explanation is now treated as completion. What used to be justified is now simply processed. And once the process becomes the authority, explanation is no longer required. A completed system is enough. When people push back, institutions respond with transparency. They'll show you the workflow, the policy document, the technical documentation, the compliance checklist, a diagram of how the system operates. And this creates the impression of explanation. If you can see the structure, if you can read the rules, if you can access the documentation, it feels like nothing is being hidden. But transparency is not the same thing as accountability. Showing someone how a system works is not the same as justifying what it did. You can describe every input, every variable, every procedural step, and still avoid answering the real question. Why was this outcome acceptable? A technical explanation of the mechanism does not answer a moral question about the result. You can point to the policy. You can reference the regulation. You can cite the internal guideline and still avoid ownership. Because transparency distributes responsibility. When everything is documented, no single person has to defend the outcome. The workflow did it. The criteria produced it. The system generated it. Complexity becomes a shield, not because it is intentionally deceptive, but because it diffuses accountability across layers. If the decision emerges from automation, from policy logic, from delegated authority, then who exactly stands behind it? Transparency describes the structure. Explanation requires a person who can say, "This was the right call," or "This was wrong, and I'm changing it." Increasingly, no one is positioned to do that. The documentation explains the machine, but the outcome explains nothing. You are shown the architecture, but you are not given a decision maker. And once documentation replaces justification, the appearance of openness becomes a substitute for accountability. The system is visible, but the authority behind it remains untouched. Here's the core trade-off these systems face. Large systems don't optimize for correctness. They optimize for scale. Scale changes what matters. When millions of decisions move every day, stability becomes the priority. A single incorrect outcome does not destabilize the system, but inconsistency can. Correcting one case introduces variation. Variation creates unpredictability. Unpredictability creates risk. Risk creates exposure. Exposure invites review. Review invites accountability. And accountability requires ownership. So correction becomes expensive. Not financially expensive at first. Structurally expensive. If one decision is overridden, the logic must be re-examined. If the logic is re-examined, the process can be questioned. And once the process is questioned, someone has to defend it. Frontline workers often agree with you. They see the problem. They understand the consequences. They may even say you're right. But agreement is not authority. Authority lives in the process. And overriding the process means stepping outside the protection it provides. It means attaching your name to an exception. It means accepting responsibility for what happens after that exception. That is a heavier burden than following the system. So the safest action is procedural compliance, not because it guarantees correctness, but because it guarantees defensibility. Defensibility protects the institution. Correction protects the individual. At scale, the institution wins. Consistency signals control. Correction signals instability. Over time, that incentive hardens. The system becomes trusted, not because it is always right, but because it is consistently applied. And consistency, even when imperfect, is easier to justify than judgment. So correction is treated as a flaw, and consistency is treated as safety. Authority didn't disappear. It moved. It used to be personal, then bureaucratic, now procedural. Personal authority required justification. Bureaucratic authority required documentation. Procedural authority requires neither. It requires completion. If the process ran, the outcome stands. Decisions exist without owners. Outcomes exist without accountability. No one made the decision in the traditional sense. The system executed, and execution is treated as legitimacy. When authority is embedded in process, explanation becomes optional. If the workflow completed successfully, there is nothing left to defend. The output is treated as sufficient. And when explanation disappears, so does responsibility. Not because responsibility was rejected, but because it was dissolved into structure. This is not about one company or one technology. It is a shift in how power is exercised. Authority no longer needs to justify itself. It only needs to function. This is one piece of a larger pattern I'm documenting. Authority without explanation. Consistency over correction. process over ownership. If this is clicking, if you're starting to recognize these structures, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. This series maps how authority changes long before anyone votes on it. And if you want the foundation behind all of this, start with the video linked here. The one rule that explains AI, no jargon. AI doesn't think, it predicts.